Right, the next text is 4.2. It's the Past Masters podcast from the Edexcel English Language and Literature Anthology, and it's entitled The Truth is in Here, UFOs at the National Archives. And that presumably being the title of the actual podcast itself that they've labelled it. Of course, it's a cultural reference to the X-Files, and it's really using that title from the X-Files series of The Truth is Out There as a phrasal template, and it's changing it to that as well. So this is obviously a podcast which I'm sure most listeners are familiar with the actual format there, and it's from the Ministry of Defence, well, not Ministry of Defence, sorry, it's from the National Archives, where they're talking about recently released Ministry of Defence files on UFOs. So it's quite an interesting little text. It's only a one-pager, so this will probably be relatively brief. So you've got a little box at the top of the page. Actually, I'll go itself after the very convincing UFO image that we have there, and so we've got the kind of text that you would get on the website itself here. So from ghost rockets in Scandinavia to mysterious spheres tracked over Eritrea, the Past Masters team look at the records of unidentified flying objects held at the National Archives and ask, is the truth in here? So all of this rhetorical question, this is all designed to get people listening to the podcast. But of course, being a podcast, you might be interested in the National Archives and be subscribe to the podcast and have those download automatically anyway. But it's not impossible that if you had an interest in UFOs that you could stumble across this podcast on an internet search. So that's really who your audience are. It's mainly going to be followers of this podcast, but potentially new listeners who are drawn to it by this news story, which is still, it's relatively recent update of the archives with these particular UFO files, which is all real. It's all there. All these files are there, and you can actually go and look these up should you want to. So, onto the actual text itself. We've got two speakers, obviously, and we've got Bob and Joe. And just to contextualise some things here, you've got Bob and Joe. You can actually hear this. This is available online. This actual podcast, you can listen to the whole thing itself with its famous funky theme. I say famous, ironically, with its very high energy theme tune, which doesn't necessarily seem to fit the subject matter in some ways. And you've got an interesting structure here where Bob is much more cynical and actually seems to be in many ways in control of the conversation, and then there's Joe, who seems to be more credulous about aliens. That seems to be the angle that they've set up. Now, either that's how they really are, or it could be for informative and entertainment purposes they've adopted these particular voices. That's something to bear in mind. It may not be, take it at face value. It may not be like that. I would hope that Bob and Joe don't sit in their office in their staff room together and Bob's always putting Joe down all the time. I'm sure that's not the case if Bob and Joe are listening, which again, unlikely. But anyway, hello to them if they are listening. Anyway, so the actual structure itself, you're going to see things like adjacency pairs, as you'd expect. Again, this is like a text where it's obviously spoken. There would have been an element of pre-planning because obviously they've got to go through the actual material and introduce that for the listeners as well. And you've got the first thing, it's actually, you've got your opening here like in a normal conversation, except it's not like a normal conversation because even though there's two people talking, it's for the benefit of other people listening and their audience. And it sets its shop up here like this, really. So you're listening to Past Masters from the National Archives in London. So you can expect that there's going to be really an historical angle to what they're talking about. And these are discourse markers. I'm Bob and I'm Joe. You'd expect there to be an introduction on a podcast like this. So Bob, and this month we're looking at one of the strangest sets of records we have here at the archives, the British government's very own X-Files. I find it a very tiresome cultural reference to anything to do with UFOs. It always lazily refers to the X-Files as if it's the only thing to do with the X-Files. Sorry, I'm putting a bit of personal moaning in here, but it's just say for your terms of what you're writing about, it's a cultural reference to the X-Files. the reason is everyone's familiar that series covers UFOs, not exclusively though, so it's inaccurate in that sense. But anyway, I digress slightly there. But cultural reference for the X-Files. Strangest, you got a superlative as well. The strangest sets of records, one of the strangest sets of records. You could say that creates a bit of intrigue about what the other ones might be. I wonder what the other strange sets of records that they've got there. Then we have Joe with a bit of elision straight away. There will be words here. It's technically grammatically incomplete, isn't it? Look, it's a minor sentence. Mysterious lights in the sky, unexplained radar traces. So that's a minor sentence to generate some excitement about what you're listening to, and in many ways, unexplained and radar traces. These are familiar collocations. Mysterious lights. You could say they're familiar collocations as well. Then you've got similar reports from military sources and members of the public and official government policy in UFOs from the old Air Ministry, the Ministry of Defence, the Foreign Office and the Admiralty. Another minor sentence, so it's a grammatically incomplete sentence there as well. And as it is the Past Masters podcast, it takes a historical angle. Actually, a bit more context. The National Archives are very popular with historians nationally. Will go and visit it, and you can research pretty much anything you want. It's also full of lots of old people looking up about their family tree as well. So if you go there, you'll have to nudge them out of the way, but not too aggressively, of course. Then we've got so this is all kind of government lexis, isn't it? Air Ministry, Ministry of Defence, Foreign Office, and the Admiralty. That's all military lexis, British military lexis as well. Bob, and why are we looking at this? Well, in some ways, this is an interrogative, of course, and in some ways, you might think it's a bit of a silly question. It's because it's the subject of the podcast. But again, you've got to bear in mind, a podcast isn't like a real conversation. It's for broadcast, over the internet. So you've got to have a bit of this kind of false conversational aspect to it. Then we have Joe's response, which is, I think... because it's a fascinating insight into workings of government, fronted conjunction there as well. And here's another one. Again, spoken text will often have fronted conjunctions because we do it all the time when we're speaking, and I think I'll probably just use one then myself. And it's secret files on aliens, exclamatory sentence here as well. You could say that's hyperbolic because it does just say UFOs. It doesn't necessarily instantly mean they're aliens, which is true from Bob here, isn't it? I think they're unexplained aerial phenomena, which is kind of official, bureaucratic, government, military phrase to describe UFOs. UFOs is more of a colloquialism, really, isn't it, when you think about it? There's a tag question there. I think they're unexplained aerial phenomena, aren't they? You've got this verb, I think. You've got the tag question, aren't they? Which creates the appearance of, you could say, conversation insecurity, but really it's a way of Bob softening the challenge of what he's saying, so it's not meant to seem so aggressive, so challenging. So you could talk about cooperative principle of conversation working here as well, and then also that's for the benefit of the listeners as well, because it creates dialogue between the two. If they've got a different opinion, if they're both agreeing on it, it's going to be, it wouldn't really work that well, really. You could do it like that, but if they're both real true believers, I don't think it's going to be that interesting a podcast. So where's the evidence that they're aliens? Now this, of course, where's the evidence? So actually this lexeme here, evidence, you think of, it's National Archives, Past Masters, historical angle. So it's about, generally, they're not always about UFOs every week. It just happens to be this one's about it. They'll be talking about various other interesting articles that have shown up or been released or something else at the National Archives. And so it's kind of evidence-based because it's the audience are probably interested in history or social history or anything like that. So that's where it comes from. And now scepticism is very healthy. In conversation, with this the kind of cooperative principle of conversation, we pretend to agree, don't we? And it mitigates the imposition of what we're saying. It seems less confrontational. Now, scepticism is very healthy, but I think when you've heard some of these documents, you might not be so sure. I think that's very unlikely. Bob doesn't seem very nice, but like I say, I think it could be a deliberate. It's a part of the voice that they're adopting. So you've got to have these two different angles on the topic to make it actually work for the audience. So that, I think that's the angle I would take with the if I was writing about this in an essay. What have you got? He asks, another interrogative. That's also, you could say that's a very confident declarative as well. We've got dozens of files containing carefully kept records of hundreds of sightings. That's probably not hyperbole, that's probably true, probably is dozens. They're using adjacency pairs, again, because it's two people in a conversation. Well, the British government first begins watching the skies in the first decade of the 20th century, and then Bob interjects with looking out for German airships before the First World War. Now that is, again, I don't think it's Bob necessarily trying to be a party pooper effectively. I think it's a case of it's the historical angle that the primary audience would be interested in. So having a factual basis rather than conjecture that it's aliens is going to appeal more to the audience. But it's more entertaining to hear if you've got both sides of this story there as well. I do find it a bit odd in that I think Bob personally should probably be showing a bit more enthusiasm because it's a way of bringing in new listeners. But like I say, you most of your podcast subscribers are going to be they're more of a historian kind of angle, so you don't want to make it too out there in terms of the content. So you don't want to make it like aliens and alienate your listeners. Sorry, that was just too good an opportunity. I do apologise. So you've got, let's have a look. So the history angle that we've got there as well, but it's nothing to do with aliens. Another assertive declarative. What else have you got? There's actually a sense of cohesion there because it's actually very similar to his earlier question. Look, there you go. What have you got? What else have you got? So there's a sense of cohesion there. Another discourse marker. Oh, interjection. Okay, World War Two. Throughout the war, so actually, so in First World War, actually, there's a logical structure here. This creates cohesion as well because you've got a logical structure through the text that's moving through time. Again, that suits with the historical angle. Throughout the war, British and American pilots report seeing strange patterns of lights on bombing runs over Germany. Like the lights you get on aircraft, comes in Bob. Again, historical angle. Poor old Joe, though. Well, sort of, but not. So there's a hedge in there as well. So Joe seems less assertive actually when you're looking at it. Joe comes in with the enthusiasm, Bob comes in with the declarative, and then the historical angle on the particular alien reference that he's making. Because to be honest, really, it wouldn't necessarily really explain all these things. If pilots are seeing it, some lights wouldn't be accounted for. It wouldn't really necessarily. So again, I think there's a lot of this is for entertainment value and to keep the historical angle consistent throughout the whole thing. That's another mystery solved then. That's familiar collocation. And I'm getting good at this as well. Then there's more familiar collocation there. So I think that's it for most of this one. I don't think there's anything else particularly to add. But like I say, bear in mind, while it seems that it's a very old way of working and it looks like Bob and Joe are hostile, I really doubt that's the case. I think it's deliberately structured like this to make it more suited to its target audience, and then to make those two, to have those two different voices. It may be kind of based on their own personalities. They're not characters as such; they're real people, so it is factual in that way. But they're probably adopting particular voices of the skeptic and the UFO believer, the more credulous one, just because it makes it more entertaining for people to listen to. So I hope you found that useful, and again, there's plenty of other ones of these to listen to, and thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.